we're back with Historical Context with the Historian. In the book, Uncle Russ calls his office to find out whether he can stay longer in Shoreham so that he can help them go on a river trip with his boat to look for Bobby Reed. He calls long distance. The book is very specific about this. And this today is something that really isn't a thing. We have cell phones. We call people all over the country. It's not a big deal. You might have to pay more if you were in another country, but even that, because we have Skype, we have FaceTime, we have Zoom, we have whatever, even that isn't really such an issue. And so having to pay more money to call far away is sort of foreign to us. But in the 1950s, and even well into the later 20th century, well into the 80s and 90s, even close to the year 2000, it was typical to pay more for a long distance call because it would have to be specially routed through operators and through machines. The very first automatic direct long distance call was in 1951. So very likely any long distance calls that were placed in the time of the book in 1953 when it was published would have had to go through a special exchange and they would have had to pay more money for it. And that was typical when I was young in the 1990s. We had to pay extra to call long distance. Once a friend of mine was out of town for the summer, and whenever I wanted to call her, it was a long distance call. We had to pay more money for it. And so my parents made me wait until later in the evening because long distance calls were cheaper in the evening. It's not that way today. But even when I was older, when I was in high school, in the early 2000s, when we had cell phones, we still had roaming charges where we would have to pay more for calls that we placed on our cell phones that were out of area. So if we were out of the state, we had to pay extra for any calls. So when we ever went out of the state, we turned our cell phones off to avoid people calling us and having to pay extra for roaming charges. And so up until quite recently, really, paying extra money for calling long distance was something that people had to do. And so calling long distance was a specific activity where you knew you would have to pay extra money for it. This is also why towards the very end of the book, when Mr. Hollister and Pete go to find a phone to inform people back in Shoreham that they have successfully found Bobby Reed, they have to go find a house, first of all, because there were no phones on the boat. They wouldn't have had cell phones, of course. This is 1953. The boat wouldn't have had a phone. And so they had to go along the stream until they found a house where there was a phone so that they could call. And you will also notice that Mr. Hollister actually gives money to the owner of the house to pay for the call. Because most likely, if they're out on the river that way, they're in a very remote area, it probably would not have been really easy for them to get phone service, and so they probably would have had to pay more for it. And so paying for phone calls was something that was very common, even though it seems kind of weird to us today